Hello everyone, I'm back again, going to continue reading If Your Name Was Changed at Ellis Islands, picking up where I left off yesterday. Yesterday we were reading about why people would leave their home countries and come to America, and today we're going to read about what the journey was like for many of them. How did people travel to the ships that brought them to America? There were many different ways people reached the port cities. If you lived out of the country, you often had to go to a big town to catch a train or catch a train to the port. When some families left, everyone came to say goodbye. In one village, the band played as a family rode off. Other people, many from Russia or Poland, left their towns in the dead of night to escape mobs that were beating and murdering people. There were many difficulties you might face before you reached the ship. Oftentimes, you would have to cross the border into another country before you reach the port. To do that, you might need a special permit, but permits were usually difficult to get. Sometimes the government of your country didn't want boys and young men to leave. They wanted them to serve in the army. You might face other problems. Thieves frequently stole your goods when you stayed at inns or slept in fields. And if you reached a border and didn't have a permit, you might have to pay a bribe to the border guard to allow you to cross. The trip overland sometimes took 2 weeks. One family had to reach the port of Istanbul to board their ship, but they were stuck in a town on the Black Sea for a year because of a local war. Finally, when you arrived at a port city, you might have to wait a week or two, sometimes longer, until the ship was ready to depart or leave. Were you examined before you left? According to a U.S. law, ship companies had to pay the return fare for anyone who had to be sent back from America. And so before leaving, ship doctors examined all passengers to see if they had any illnesses that would prevent them from being allowed to enter the United States. The doctors vaccinated and disinfected all passengers. Men and boys often had their hair cut very short, and women and girls had theirs combed very carefully to look for lice, which carried the deadly disease typhus. The ship companies had also to prepare a manifest, which is a list of information about everybody on board the ship. Each immigrant was assigned a number. The ship's captain listed everyone's nationality, age, gender, destination, and occupation. Travelers were asked if they could read and write, whether they were married, how many pieces of baggage they had. This list was given to the immigration inspectors when the ship landed in America. How long would the ocean trip take? Until the mid-1800s, most people came to America on sailing ships. These were usually about 40 days to cross the Atlantic Ocean. But it sometimes could take up to 6 months. By the late 1800s, steamships had replaced sailing ships, and the trip was much faster. If there were no bad storms or other problems, the trip usually took anywhere from 6 to 32 days. A lot shorter. Where would you sleep and eat on the ship? If you traveled first or second class, you would have a private cabin to sleep in, and food would be served in a dining room. But most immigrants traveled the least expensive way, in steerage. The steerage area was below the deck on the lowest level of the ship. Several hundred passengers were crammed into steerage with no fresh air. They slept in narrow bunk beds, sometimes 3 high. When one 7-year-old came from Barbados in January, she and her other passengers were so cold on board that many of them were frostbitten. Usually there was one bath for all the steerage passengers, with sink faucets that frequently didn't work. Immigrants talked about the filth in the steerage area. The food for steerage passengers wasn't much better than their sleeping areas. Lukewarm soup, boiled potatoes, and stringy beef were often the only items on the menu. Many immigrants reported that all they ate was herring, bread, potatoes, and tea. The one good thing about so much herring, some said, is that it helps prevent seasickness. Herring is a type of fish. One reporter who wanted to see what it was like to travel in steerage boarded a ship in Naples, Italy in 1906. When he arrived in America, he wrote, "How can a steerage passenger remember that he is a human being when he must first pick the worms from his food and eat in his stuffy, stinking bunk or in the hot atmosphere of a compartment where 150 men sleep?" So here are some illustrations of what steerage looked like. Really tight and really not luxurious. What would you do all day? If the weather was good, you could spend as much time as possible on deck and out of the steerage area. Some kids played marbles or dominoes. Others helped sailors with chores. Sometimes there were religious services. One young boy said that if the day was clear, the woman would go up on the deck and wash the children's hair. His mother had told him they'd all be sent back home if the American immigration inspectors found lice. Children frequently had the best time of anyone on board. They'd wander around the ship listening to all the different languages, sometimes learning a few words in English. Was the ocean voyage dangerous? Shipwrecks, sickness, and fires were all main worries. Carl Rafe was on a ship in 1892 when a fierce storm began to rage. Many people started to vomit. He wrote in his diary, "I also got very dizzy. So far as your eyes can see is nothing but high waves and a whole ocean in an uproar. In the night, a little baby was born. Through all the motion of the ship, it came too soon." Surviving storms was sometimes easier than surviving sickness on board. On one ship, all the children came down with the measles. Some died and some were buried at sea. In the mid-1800s, ship conditions were so crowded and unsanitary that diseases spread rapidly. Thousands died from typhus, called ship fever, and cholera. So many people died from these diseases that some newspapers called the ships swimming coffins. By the end of the 1800s, most people were traveling by steamship. These ships were larger, made of iron, then steel, and were less damaged by storms and fires. In addition, these conditions, particularly in steerage, were crowded, but not as bad in earlier years on the sailing ships. There were still outbreaks of disease, but every ship had a doctor on board and ways of separating sick passengers from everyone else. Would you go straight to Ellis Island when you arrived in New York Harbor? When a ship arrived in New York Harbor, immigrants crowded the decks and looked at the tall buildings. The mountains of New York, sometimes they called them. Greeting the newcomers was the Statue of Liberty, rising, it seemed, right out of the water. Some thought it was a statue of Christopher Columbus. Others knew it as Lady Liberty, who welcomed immigrants to the New World. Everyone knew it meant they had finally arrived. All the ships were stopped in lower New York Bay where doctors boarded. They checked the passengers for contagious diseases like typhus, yellow fever, smallpox, cholera. And there were 2 small islands in the lower bay. If you were sick, you'd be put in a hospital on one of them. If the doctors thought you had been exposed to a disease, they'd place you on the other for observation. In later years, Ellis Island itself had been a hospital for people with contagious diseases. A little further up the bay, immigration officers examined all the first and second class passengers. Then a boat would dock at the tip of Manhattan, and those passengers who had passed inspection would get off free to enter the country. Steerage passengers, however, had to go to Ellis Island. Frequently, they stayed on board ship for 1 or more nights until barges could take them over to Ellis Island for further examination. One 19-year-old immigrant said as he watched the first and second class passengers leave the ship, "Isn't it strange that here we are coming to a country where there is complete equality, but not quite so for newly arrived immigrants?" I'm going to stop there for today. I hope you enjoyed reading about the voyages people took to get to Ellis Island. Tomorrow I'll continue with if your name was changed at Ellis Island.